I think on the flip side, people with ADHD, and especially like everyone with disabilities, it can be really, really embarrassing and awkward. And you don't want to say, like, I'm struggling with this because of my ADHD, because it can feel like an excuse.
How can businesses factor ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions into their inclusion policies?
Well, if you are a business, I would recommend the first place is looking at the policies that you've already got. The inclusion policies often don't mention disability and reasonable adjustments. And I think for businesses, they can really struggle when talking about neurodiversity, because on the one hand, it is incredibly valuable to businesses. It's a very topical topic at the moment. So people are often talking about the superpowers. When I'm doing talks, I often highlight the strengths of, for example, ADHD and other neurodivergent conditions. But it also is a disability. People are diagnosed with ADHD, for example, because their symptoms amount to a disorder. So that triggers for companies the duty to make reasonable adjustments and make sure that their employees are protected against discrimination at work under the Equality Act in the UK. So I think that's kind of the legal side of it, but the practical side of it is actually just making sure that you have thought about the fact that so many people right now are finding out that they're neurodivergent. Adults in the UK couldn't be diagnosed with ADHD until 2008, so we're seeing a huge number of adults at the moment become diagnosed with it. And even without that diagnosis as well, there are so many people that are debating to go for the assessment before the waiting times, but factoring in all of these people with really accessible policies that have language which are like human to human instead of like HR and like not accessible to your average person. I think just explaining what will happen next, giving reassurance, like putting a centralized point of contact, giving people the option to talk anonymously if they want to is really simple and really easy, and can help avoid so many challenges down the line, because I think often people just want to know what would happen if they did tell their employer, but they don't feel comfortable putting themselves out there if they don't have to. But having best practice, also just sharing experiences, for example, on blog posts or podcasts. Like we recorded a podcast with a manager and someone that she line managed who was going through the ADHD process, and showed how easy it is to actually be inclusive. But it's just basically comes down to the human to human level, away from the scary legal talking about mental health, like not really sure how to do this level. But if you can make it as practical and accessible as possible, that's a really good place to start.
What inspired you to write ADHD and A to Z, your book?
This book? Well, I found it. I wrote this after I was diagnosed with ADHD 5 years ago at the age of 25. When I was diagnosed with it, I didn't think that ADHD was a real problem, and I learned that it was actually a real condition. I was supposed to go back to the doctor after a holiday for 3 weeks, and instead I left and moved in with someone that I met on the beach. Did a partner visa with them, came back a year later and was like, I believe you. Okay. So for me, that year was actually really helpful to learn about a bit more about what ADHD was and how it was affecting me, and being able to like kind of prove it to myself in that way, that it wasn't just something that, like, I had people in my life that were like, oh, it's just something psychiatrists are making up to get money and put you on medication and things. And so it was really difficult for me to accept that help. But then I managed to get a job in law. I did mental health and disability law and immigration law. But I was still struggling. So I was like, yeah, I've become a normal human being. And I had medication, which made me really sick in the beginning as well. And I really struggled to get off this private pathway where I was expected to pay £300 a month for medication. That's not going to work for me. I don't have £300 a month. And I had a really tough time getting back to the NHS. My psychiatrist told me that pretty much wasn't possible. So I had to get really, really sick and demand a letter when I found out that it actually was possible all along. I found out also along the journey that access to work is government support that can help pay for things like ADHD coaching, even before you were diagnosed formally with something, which just for all of this information was so important, and no one tells you it. And I went to see my GP about my medication. They said, if you want to change your medication levels, then you have to wait 7 years. I was like, oh. I was like, what was that? But they meant like 7 months. And they're like, oh no, 7 years, because that's how long our assessment waiting list is. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, if I'd had to wait 7 years, I would be dead. I wouldn't be here anymore, because that's what led to me getting that diagnosis. And I just thought that it was really important to share my experience and what I could from the challenges and the good things that have happened, but to help other people out there, because I just thought for all of those people on that huge list, like, what are they doing? So it was really amazing to be able to just write it out and put it in the world, and here we are now. So.
As the founder of ADHD Works, what do you hope your training provides businesses?
And we've got lots of different training, because I've got ADHD, so once I learned how to make a course, I was like, but it's been amazing. So overall, I think I just love doing the training for companies like Disney and Microsoft and Yahoo, and like those huge international corporations, and being able to have these conversations, which can be quite vulnerable. And I think for people working in really like high prestige companies like that, it can be really scary to put your job at risk and stand out of the crowd. But what I really love about the kind of trainings that I do there and these big talks and sharing my experiences is that people always end up sharing their experiences, and it turns into a very organic, natural conversation that helps a lot of people. Even I think what I've seen as well is like not just people themselves that are neurodivergent, but their children, and they don't have anywhere to get that support or have these conversations. So it's really amazing for employers to be able to do that. It's incredible to see it helping employers actually help provide support, like access to work, like helping people actually apply for this, because it's really helpful government funding for people in work that can pay for training, and also like even helping them with their assessments to get that under private insurance that they've got. I really love being able to teach people how to like manage people. So we've got a course now for managers and HR and leaders on how to manage people with ADHD, but pretty much any neurodivergent condition, because it's just having those coaching skills and being able to talk to someone and get past the awkwardness and understand like, okay, what are we trying to achieve here? Because when you're diagnosed with ADHD, for example, no one gives you a book, a shovel, but no one says, great, this is your brain, these are the things that you need, and then you're going to be perfectly fine.
So in your experience, what are the most common ways people discriminate against those with ADHD?
I think the main one that I see is a failure to make reasonable adjustments, which is incredibly annoying because so many reasonable adjustments are actually free, like really easy. They are just changes to the way that a company works, like a practice or procedure or policy. And essentially the point of it is that it levels up a person with a disability to be able to have the same opportunities as other people that are not disabled. And I think there's a real lack of understanding of like the meaning of disability in the law, and I think this is the kind of things that I do there of like breaking them down, because disability can be quite a loaded word. I talked to one employer and I said, what is your policy on disclosing a disability? And they were like, it's optional. I was like, that's not a policy. That's just, they were like, it's personal to each person. I was like, that's not. But like, I think for the individuals, if you don't understand, like, it was only for me working in disability law that I understood, like, it's something that impacts your ability to do your job like other people, essentially a health condition. I didn't think ADHD was a disability when I started my job. It's only from doing law that I understand it. So helping other people to have that same understanding as well, because it's not something that's widely understood. It's a very loaded word. And it's a very important word because it triggers really important legal duties for employers, because under the Equality Act, it's the one characteristic that requires employers to do something proactively in making these adjustments. Like, instead of just not don't discriminate against someone, they also have to like actually do something proactively. And it's really hard because it's not clear what that thing is, but they've got to try. They've got to at least make an effort to understand what that thing is. And I think there's no real clear explanation of how you should be doing that, but things like having the policy in place, having conversations with people about these tricky, vulnerable conversations about what does work for you, what doesn't work for you, what changes would be reasonable to make, what changes wouldn't be reasonable for us to make, and like being able to communicate that in a way I think for employers is quite scary because they're like, well, what do we do if they are not happy? Because again, like the rate of employment tribunal cases relating to invisible conditions like ADHD and autism, these neurodivergent conditions, has risen by over 30% in the last year. So it's really, really important because also for employers, like the damages that are available there is uncapped for disability discrimination. And I think it can really often come out of someone telling their employer they've got ADHD, for example, or they might have ADHD because these GTs are triggered actually immediately as soon as the employer is aware that someone might have a disability, regardless of the formal medical diagnosis. And then like just not conversations not happening. So people will say they've told their employer about having ADHD. The employer's like, what help do you want? They're like, I don't know. And then nothing happens. But they're really struggling, or maybe they'll ask for help in a slightly different way and be like, oh, because I think on the flip side, people with ADHD, and especially like everyone with disabilities, it can be really, really embarrassing and awkward, and you don't want to say like, I'm struggling with this because of my ADHD, because it can feel like an excuse. But then if you don't ask and then you're burnt out and explode at the end and you're like, that's not great either. So I think it's that education of like, what is ADHD, so that it's a general organization, people are aware and they're not discriminating in the kind of flippant way, which I think also is a really tricky thing because we're living in a world where there's so much misinformation on the internet, even the news. I remember seeing a recent article kind of saying that people with ADHD and autism are making it all up. So it's really hard for employers to then manage that within their workplaces if this stuff is being said like in the news.
What do you hope people take away from your public speeches?
Oh, I hope they take away empathy for their fellow human beings. I hope they take away just the understanding that it's okay to be yourself, like in any capacity. For me personally, that is what kind of ADHD journey has been about. Learning that I had ADHD enabled me to stop trying to force myself to be normal and to fit in like everyone else, but to start actually just working with what I had, and embracing like the parts of me that were good at certain things and finding help for the things that I struggled with, which have been life-changing. And you don't have to be neurodivergent for that to resonate with you, but in general, like anybody can apply that. But instead of holding ourselves to these unrealistic standards where we're just expected to do more and more and more, with less and less support, but actually being a bit more human to each other, having that awareness that everyone works differently, and that's not a bad thing. That's a great, valuable, wonderful thing, but like there can be real challenges and real strengths accompanied with that. And hopefully just, I really like basically giving people as practical and tangible and useful information as possible, because having ADHD myself, like I have to have, and the talks and things that I do like have to be interesting, otherwise I would get bored. So I like giving people very like interactive things to do that resonate with people. So hopefully they like it.